We attended Netroots Nation in Philadelphia last week. Now, Netroots Nation being originally a gathering of sort of lefty bloggers. I think I went the first year or the second year and have been there a number of times ever since. It's changed over the years. One of the people I ran into there was our friend Ryan Grimm. Ryan is, of course, the Washington bureau chief for The Intercept, formerly that. Before that, Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post, and author of the new book, which I happen to have here in my hand. We've got people from Jesse Jackson to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, The End of Big Money and the Rise of a Movement. And I would say there's some intersection between that book's theme and the events of the last week, including Netroots Nation. So first of all, Ryan Grimm, thanks for coming back on the program.
You got it. Yeah, tons of intersection. If people haven't bought this book, they should press pause and go get it right now. Read it from start to finish, and then come back, because then they'll be fully informed for this conversation. But if not, if they don't have quite the time for that, I think we can probably manage. What do you think?
Well, I think we probably can, but yeah. And of course, I know you're saying that strictly because you want a fully informed audience to get the full richness of what we're about to say. And we will do our best. So first of all, let's start with Netroots Nation. The three of the four members of the squad appeared, accompanied by Representative Deb Haaland and some other progressive women for a sort of rousing morning plenary session. We had a candidate forum that included basically Elizabeth Warren and three other people would be one way to summarize that.
Yes.
And then, of course, there were a lot of breakout events, lots of side interactions and all of that. What was your takeaway from that event?
Well, which one? The Elizabeth Warren?
No, the whole thing. The whole 4 days or whatever it was, or however much you saw of it.
It felt, interestingly more hopeful and less angry than a typical Netroots had been in the past. And I don't know, what exactly would account for that. What's interesting about the place is that it's a very it's Warren country. Like, if there's anywhere in the kind of political universe that is Warren country, it's Netroots. She was a blogger herself, in the 2000s. She speaks that language, and she was much more a part of the kind of rise of the Netroots than even Bernie Sanders was. The folks there support what Sanders stands for, but by the time Sanders rose in 2015 with the presidential election, Warren was kind of already had won the hearts and minds of this Netroots crew, and particularly Marcos Malitzis and some others at Daily Kos are not fans at all of Bernie Sanders, and they are very much associated with the convention. So I think it's probably not a total coincidence that Bernie Sanders didn't show up. I don't think it was only a scheduling conflict. When he came out 4 years ago, he got famously protested, and I think that the protests over the years have worn away or have worn down candidates' willingness to show up, because candidates are always nervous about the unexpected. Campaigns are partly driven around the idea of preparing for the unexpected and meticulously planning out their campaigns. Warren even faced a protest, but it was such a weak and silly one that it almost felt like Warren herself had organized it.
Well, see, I had another take. You've said multiple things, Ryan, that I want to unpack a little bit. But as far as the protest is concerned, I'll tell you what struck me about the protest was I was there for the protest against Elizabeth Warren. I was there and working for Bernie for the protest.
Was that you holding that banner?
Pardon me?
Was that you holding that banner?
Was. Well, look, no, here's what struck me about it, Ryan. When the protest happened against Bernie, the protesters were invited up on stage to confront him. Mm-hmm. When the protest happened against Elizabeth Warren, they were asked to be quiet and let her answer, and they were escorted out of the room. That was striking to me. Maybe there's nothing to it, but it struck me that, maybe the difference in the handling of those two groups of protesters might help explain why Bernie chose not to go.
Yeah, but also the protesters this time around weren't really even trying to get on the stage, weren't really even asking for a spot on the stage. And for those of you out there who didn't see it, they unfurled a giant banner that said, "Legalize the 11 million immigrants and stop separating families." That's a demand that Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi would agree to.
Mm-hmm.
The consensus Democratic position is that families should not be separated, and that the 11 million people here without papers should be given a pathway to citizenship. That's most blue dogs in the party would be okay with that. So the demands were so modest that it was strange. And so, but you're right that they were not invited up on stage, and the crowd was very much with Warren, which was the opposite when Sanders was protesting.
Well, and there's a good point, and I also want to go back to the sort of affinity, the natural affinity between an Elizabeth Warren and this crowd, as opposed to even a Bernie Sanders. I noticed that too, and I think that it's not just whatever Marcos is. Milica says, founder of Daily Kos, and this thing grew out of Daily Kos, but was really community run by the community of people who commented on Daily Kos, the sort of left liberal blogger world of the 2000s. But it strikes me as a deep cultural affinity, because that group of bloggers, leaving even Marcos aside for a second, that group of bloggers loves to get elbow deep in policy. They're less excited about great principles and ideals, and more, how do we get a higher percentage of whatever ROI on this social policy.
Right.
And so Elizabeth Warren, in that sense, I would think they would feel a natural affinity too. You mentioned they kind of came up together, and it's true, Elizabeth Warren has been known to a lot of those people for a long time. And Elizabeth Warren, and by the way, I love, I think she's great. It's not about Elizabeth Warren per se, but she is also somebody that a Democratic blogger, can get excited about without really questioning their identity as a Democratic blogger. She's always, I guess she was a Republican at one point, but she's always run as a Democrat. She's always identified as a Democrat. She doesn't bring up socialism. She challenges it and says she's a capitalist. So you can be for all sorts of good policies without challenging the underlying premise of democratic politics. And I have a feeling that that's a sweet spot for a lot of people in this particular world. What do you think?
Well, and it's certainly helped by the presence of Sanders in the campaign. And so there is, like you said, there's this cultural affinity. She appeals to, professional, the professional managerial class, the educated Democratic voters, grad degree and above, she dominates with. But for those who do also have that partisan affinity for Democrats, they can look past the internal wars that she's waged with the Rubin wing of the Democratic Party, because Sanders is in the race, because Sanders is not even a Democrat, as you will be constantly reminded on Twitter. Because Sanders is such an existential threat to some of these folks, it makes Elizabeth Warren look a lot more palatable. If Warren were in this alone and Bernie Sanders had just never decided to run for president in the first place in 2015, and he was still just the same gadfly from Vermont that we have always known, then I think Warren would be much less appealing to a lot of those kind of party players, who then would be looking a lot more closely at the things that she had said about Obama or his senior officials during the administration. So I think it's a little bit of both going on.
And I've had, I've had the same thought essentially, Ryan Grimm. But it seems to me, if that's the case, then there's a lot of talk back and forth about should there be both a Bernie and an Elizabeth Warren in this race? Are they splitting the progressive vote? If you add them together, they'd be, at this point, I think beating Joe Biden, but leaving aside the fact that they appeal to different voters, which I want to get back to in a second. That's kind of evidence that Bernie has moved the Overton window, or the window of acceptable political discourse, because the fact is, I remember, and I've mentioned this elsewhere, including on this program, when Elizabeth Warren spoke out against the so-called Citigroup amendment that was really drafted for Democrats by Citigroup, the bank the mega bank they're most cozy with. When she lacerated them by name, one after another, that was a real FU kind of moment to the Democratic establishment that should have rendered her a pariah forever, and now she's a safe choice. Almost.
And that is something Sanders doesn't do. Sanders, by labeling himself an independent and a democratic socialist, has the reputation for somebody who's willing to name names and throw bombs. But in fact, you won't find many an instance at all of him doing something like Warren did, which is list the names of the people who are selling out Dodd-Frank to Wall Street in 2017. Right. He will name he'll say millionaires and billionaires, and he'll call out the proper industries, but he will never criticize Chuck Schumer, for instance.
Right. That's a great point. And I guess because he sees himself as a legislator. I'm theorizing. I have no idea why that would be, but I think it's a very interesting observation. And then you get this sort of tension between the Warren wing and the Sanders wing. But I don't experience it as tension the way I experience, for example, a tension between the squad wing of the Democratic Party, and the governing wing. So obviously there's a difference between Warren and Sanders, but it seems to me the recently released polling data showing that they appeal, that as you said, that Warren appeals to the professional class, Bernie tends to appeal to younger, less educated in some cases, lower income groups. That to me is really interesting. I'm not sure. I haven't fully processed that data, I guess, and figured out what I think about it, but I find it very interesting.
Oh, it very much is. It's what's so fascinating about it is that they really do pull from, despite saying basically the same things and standing for basically the same things, they pull from completely different parts of the coalition. Like you said, younger people, Bernie Sanders dominates among Hispanic voters, voters without, Democrats without a college degree, whereas Warren dominates among older voters and 40 and up, and those with college and graduate degrees and more disposable income. It's funny to see that she had a $28 average donation compared to Bernie Sanders' famous $27. So that extra dollar of disposable income that the Warren people have. No, I'm kidding, but you're right that that combination, if you can convince those camps to get together, that's a dominant force in Democratic politics, and I think it lines up with two camps that I talk a lot about in the book, actually, which is kind of the indivisible moms and their kids in many ways, that who are in Democratic Socialists of America and otherwise, young socialists who are willing to play within the party structure, and though they are so different in background and disposition, and somewhat in tactics, the things that they stand for are pretty indistinguishable.
Yeah, I find that fascinating too, and I'm not sure why it's played out that way. If it's a matter of biography and Elizabeth Warren's, Ivy League background, if it's a matter of just accent. I mean, I just don't get it. But I do agree with you that it's important and significant. It would be great if we can unify these factions. Again, we're
Right, because
talking.
both of those factions are suspicious of each other.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and I
and you
think
gotta get
about
over that suspicion.
And I think about, for example, Thomas Frank's writing in his book Listen Liberal, and the fact that the sort of upper 10% of income, let's say 90% to 99%, that leans Democratic, has really begun to dominate the Democratic Party structure in some ways. That's what Tom writes about. If we can get them together with people who are working for a living, younger people, you do have a hell of a coalition. And again, we're talking with Ryan Graham, author of the book We've Got People, that somebody handed to me. But I have read it, and I endorse it, and also Washington bureau chief for The Intercept. And I alluded to briefly to the conflicts in Congress between the Squad, as they're now known, which is AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's part of the subtitle of your book, and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who I'm fortunate enough to be on a panel with at this Netroots Nation, and Ayanna Pressley. So 4 young women of color, members of Congress, I believe all of whom were backed by Justice Democrats. I believe all of them challengers to incumbent Democratic members of Congress. I know 2 of them were.
Right, say that again.
Were all 4 members of the Squad challengers to incumbent Democrats?
No. So Rashida Tlaib replaced John Conyers, who left with a Me Too scandal, if you remember.
Right.
And Ilhan Omar replaced Keith Ellison, who
right.
left to run for Attorney General and won, despite his own scandal that kind of fizzled. Hence his victory.
But they represent, I think.
But they all replaced men, interestingly. 2 replaced white men and 2 replaced black men.
So they've come to symbolize, it seems, a challenge to the internal authority of the Democratic establishment in Congress. It seems to me that what we've seen, but I obviously want your thoughts. My impression is we've seen, especially over the past couple of weeks, a pattern of ongoing escalation between especially the 4 members of the Squad, as they're known, and Democratic leadership, especially Nancy Pelosi, where it just seems, every given day I kept thinking, well, this is going to wind down now, and it keeps kind of ramping up, and other people get drawn in on the Pelosi side, other people get drawn in on the Squad side, and I'm wondering, you recently wrote a piece about this with Rachel Cohen, but I'm wondering just what's going on here.
Right, Pelosi had continued to pick this fight over and over. She as the Green New Deal was being rolled out, she kind of made fun of it as the Green Dream or whatever. She later said that a glass of water could be elected in Ocasio-Cortez's district,
but not Joe Crowley, apparently.
But not that glass of water,
right?
And the Squad had not generally responded. When Ocasio-Cortez was asked about the Green Dream comment, she said, "I'm with Pelosi. It is a dream. It is a great dream, and we should dream big dreams." Just trying to be as politic about it as possible. Underneath it, of course, there were tensions. We can't forget that AOC occupied her office, which is quite an aggressive move for a freshman coming into Congress.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Pelosi, did not create the type of climate change committee that Ocasio-Cortez wanted, and offered her a seat on this much watered down panel, which she declined, and they hadn't and still haven't talked directly since then. But actually, and her decision not to join the panel shows the power that she has to drive the agenda. Are you aware that the Select Committee on Climate Change has ever met?
I'm not aware. I've not heard whether it's met or not. I follow this stuff pretty closely.
I hadn't either, and I thought it hadn't, and I was prepared to write a story saying that this committee hadn't even met. It's July and it hasn't even met. So I went to its hearing schedule. Lo and behold, they met in April. They met in May. They met in June. I think they might even have a hearing today. Yet the tree falling in the forest.
Yeah.
With nobody there. So without Ocasio-Cortez there, and without the buy-in of Sunrise and the environmental movement, the climate movement behind it, they might as well not even be having these hearings. And Ocasio-Cortez's argument was what it needs to do is actually draft a Green New Deal, draft real legislation that Democrats can debate, and that they can fight over in 2021. Then, if they win the White House, perhaps Pelosi's still scarred from the climate change bill that she passed in 2009, and pushed a lot of frontline Democrats to vote for, who then end up losing their seats and blaming it in 2010.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's actually a great point, Brian Grimm, which is when I look at the Pelosi Congress of 2008 to 2010, they did some pretty good things, and that's one of them.
They did a much better Affordable Care Act.
They did a much better Affordable Care Act. They did I wrote a piece at the time, but they did good environmental legislation. They did several things, a number of things, and it may be that there are two things I guess I would say about Nancy Pelosi. One is, first of all, I hadn't thought about whether she feels she lost in 2010 because of the progressive legislation she passed. I certainly don't think that's true. I think that there are many other interpretations for the 2010 loss, not the least of which was the lack of any support from President Obama, but multiple factors going into that. But I do think, as I said, two things about Nancy Pelosi. She has some foundational ideas about the way she's trying to run the House, a lot of which I disagree with, but I get that they're her ideas, okay?
Right.
She believes that moderate Democrats are majority makers. I believe that's a misreading of the historical moment and of who won and who didn't, but I get that she believes that, okay?
Right.
She believes that, still believes that the center is the way to go. On policy, on an ideological basis, she still supports PAYGO. I get all of that there is a genuine ideological difference between Nancy Pelosi and an AOC or a squad, or me for that matter. And I get that, and I respect that, and I understand that. And we can go back to that, but what I don't understand is why this conflict keeps escalating. In other words, is she just, I can imagine it's annoying as hell if you're Nancy Pelosi and you've been doing this for 40 years and a 29-year-old, in your view, is telling you how to do your job. I can imagine just on an empathetic level that would be aggravating. But I can also imagine that you don't get to be in Nancy Pelosi's position by just reacting every time you're annoyed.
Right.
So I don't get what's impelling. We can talk about the squad side of this too and whether they should be doing anything differently, but I don't get what's motivating Nancy Pelosi to act the way she is toward them.
My best guess is that she wants to marginalize this energy and marginalize this group of lawmakers. And I don't know if she's been successful at that or not. She's certainly in their heads. She's certainly causing major problems for them. But at the same time, she's elevating their profile while she does it. And when you have to assume if you do a public fight with inside the Democratic Party, that Trump's going to get involved. Like, that's what he does.
Right.
He's never going to miss a chance to insert himself into something. Part of it is just narcissism that I think he saw news being made by people that were not him, and that bothered him. So he needed to just get in that one way or the other. And so she criticizes the squad. She or somebody in her orbit puts out polling saying that they're unpopular with white people. It invites Trump in, and so Trump comes in, and then he doesn't come in with any kind of nuanced, sympathetic critique of what they're up to. He tells them all to go back to their home countries, which is both racist and absurd. And then it devolves into where we are now. So if Pelosi's goal was to marginalize them, instead she's elevated them, and she's kind of linked up the Democratic Party with them more than they were before, because now you have everybody standing with Ilhan and standing with AOC, from celebrities to rank and file members of Congress. So,
and you have Pelosi herself
right.
and the rest of the Democratic caucus standing with them, because morally, they realized they had to do that once they became the targets of this racist attack. So they set in motion, and I would only add to everything you've said, I guess, that and to my surprise, that Nancy Pelosi has heard the kind of George Lakoff argument, which is also basically common sense, that if you elevate somebody you disagree with by attacking them repeatedly, you give them more power and more energy. So, which is what you're saying. So, but I'm still, I still don't, I guess it was a strategy that maybe didn't work out. I don't know.
I think it's significantly that it just wasn't executed well. She sees every decision through the lens of how does this help the swing district Democrats, the swing district incumbents, and how does this help protect the Democratic majority? And so she thought that she could split the squad off from these centrist and conservative Democrats to give them some cover and say, we're not part of the Green New Deal crew. We're not part of this Justice Democrats crew. But like you said, she didn't take into account how Trump was going to react. And so instead, she wound up kind of solidifying the ties between the rest of the party and the squad.
Yeah, and again, I guess I would say that, protecting the Democratic majority, I get why she would do it. That's her job. I mean, she should be thinking in those terms. I mean, in the ecosystem, it's not her role to be the leading edge of, whatever.
But that's the other contradiction, is that who else's is it? She's the highest elected official, and there's no nominee for the party. So at some point, somebody there are these moments in history where there isn't an obvious leader, and then it kind of devolves to the highest elected official, and you have to presume some of that responsibility if it falls to you.
Yeah, well, okay, I see that, and I guess I would also say
you don't have to.
You don't have to do anything, but I mean I guess I would say that to that, it goes back to what I was saying before, which is I actually think I think most of us who are, for example, supporting Medicare for all can sell it to the swing districts. We were told that expanding Social Security would hurt the swing districts. It's helping them. It helped Conor Lamb get elected. I think we could
Abolish
sell.
ICE didn't hurt.
What?
Abolish ICE didn't even hurt.
Abolish ICE didn't hurt? Yeah, I mean, which is really just a reorg of the whole Homeland Security establishment. We could name issue after issue, even Green New Deal, where he said, no, well, people will have better jobs. And so, so I do think it's a way of thinking that needs to change. I guess before we go off this, anything the squad could be doing differently and better, you think?
That's interesting. I mean, they didn't really come after the Ocasio-Cortez team for their genuine screw up, which was the rollout of the Green New Deal, which included that erroneously posted FAQ, which talked about banning airplanes and cow farts and burgers, and which wasn't necessarily meant for public consumption and somehow slipped out. Like that was an own goal. That was an error. They could have, the establishment could come after the AOC team for that, but didn't. So one thing they've got to do is button up and um, not make any mistakes. Period, because the stakes are so high. It's a rather difficult thing to advise somebody to do. Don't ever make a mistake.
Right, right.
But I think they also have to decide whether or not they're all in on primarying Democrats who don't represent their districts effectively, or whether they're not. Right now, the Ocasio-Cortez team will have the chief of staff and other members of her orbit all endorsing publicly a primary challenger, like Jessica Cisneros down in Texas running against Henry Cuellar. And then when AOC gets asked about it, she'll say, I haven't really been following that race. And I don't think there's really anybody in the caucus who's mollified by that.
So it sounds like they don't really have an ironclad strategy for that yet. I mean,
unless that's their strategy to try to be public facing, that her position public facing is neutrality, while she gives freedom to people very close to her and in her staff to endorse candidates. I mean, that would be a strategy, but it's not one that translates to the rest of the caucus. The rest of the caucus doesn't see that and say, oh, well, I guess AOC is neutral then.
And the one area where there's bound to be conflict with the Nancy Pelosi is, Nancy Pelosi has multiple constituencies, including her district in San Francisco, but she's elected by the current caucus. So she certainly is likely to go after somebody who says, as a matter of practice and policy, I'm going to support challengers to members of the caucus that elected Nancy Pelosi, right? So there's an inherent conflict I support the idea of better Democrats,
right.
But there's an inherent conflict in being a member of Congress and doing that and not expecting heat from Nancy Pelosi, right?
Yeah, and it's there for Ocasio-Cortez too, and the rest of the squad. These are people that you are in meetings with, that you're working with every day, that right. you're hoping to get to co-sponsor your bills and give some conservative credibility to them. It's not like going after Republicans, which back in the day used to even be difficult for some members of Congress because they'd work so closely with incumbent Republicans. But now it's so partisan, it's not a problem. But there's some real issues with being an elected member of Congress and then also being a movement figure. It's very difficult. What's ironic, and this is a story I'm working on right now, is that there's a caucus called the Four Country Caucus, which is basically funded by the With Honor PAC, which is Jeff Bezos and Howard Schultz's dark money group that was helping to elect veterans of both parties to Congress. That caucus, which includes Jimmy Panetta, Max Rose, Connor Lamb, a lot of about 10 Democratic veterans, is now getting behind a Navy officer who's running against Katie Hill, who's a Democratic incumbent. And so Justice Democrats is not backing any Republicans running against frontline Democrats. They're not even running primary challengers against swing seat Democrats. They're only going after people who represent districts that are deeply blue. And so whoever wins the primary is going to win the general election. But yet here's this band of centrists who are actively involved in a caucus whose PAC is supporting a Republican against a vulnerable Democrat. And Katie Hill is not the most left-wing Democrat out there, but she's been pretty progressive, considering that she's from a swing seat that she flipped from red to blue. She went with Ocasio-Cortez to occupy McConnell's office. So she didn't occupy Pelosi's office, but occupying McConnell's office does take courage in a swing seat. And she's been an independent voice. And here come 10 Democrats, whether they know it or not, because some of these PACs operate without consulting some of the members. But here they come. They're going to be used by the Republican in his effort to make Katie Hill, a former congresswoman.
Yeah, and I wonder if the DCCC is going to do what it's done for the left and pull.
And we'll see. You know, most of these guys had big DCCC support. Guys and gals had big DCCC support to get to Congress in the first place. Gil Cisneros, Celine Lauria, Jason Crow. You know, these are people that are now biting the hand that fed them.
Well, all this opens a whole other conversation I wish we could have, so maybe we'll have you back because we've run out of time.
So.
But me too. And so Ryan Grimm, Washington Bureau Chief at The Intercept and author of this fine book, which I hold in my hand, We've Got People, by Strong Arm Press. Thanks for your great reporting. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.